Hi, everybody. Welcome to Chicago Jewish Cafe. Today we have a very special guest. His name is Professor Alan Johnson. He is a member of the Labour Party in Britain and Unite the Union fraction, coalition, whatever you want to call it. He is the founder and editor of Fathom, a journal that he established for better understanding of Israel and Near East or Middle East, whatever you want to call it. He is a senior research fellow at BICOM, that is British Israeli Communication Organization, nonprofit organization, and he has contributed to Guardian, Dissent, Haaretz, New Politics, World Affairs, New York Times, New Statements, Statesman, as you see by the type of publications that he contributed to. This is mostly left-wing publications. But he also appeared on BBC and Al Jazeera, Islam Channel, and Sky. In any case, he is author of many articles and reports, and one of the latest report that he has produced is the institutionally anti-Semitic. That is the report on the current state of the Labour Party in England. We have invited Alan to talk about it and to let us know what really is going on in England, I mean, outside of Brexit, but also maybe in connection with Brexit, but also with regard to the left wing of politics in that country. Alan, welcome to Chicago Jewish Cafe.
Thank you for inviting me, Alexander. Very glad to be here.
It's our honor and pleasure. In any case, yesterday, the ex-Labour MP, Joan Ryan, delivered a talk to IPAC here in the United States, and where she declared that she is no longer associate of Labour Party after 40 years of being a member and MP, so she was one of the leading members in that party. She said that the last 40 years in England in Labour Party was where the problem lies. What can you tell us about it?
Well, the problem certainly goes back a long way. I've been writing this article all of my political life, really. I began, I guess, as a student in the mid-1980s in England. I'm not myself Jewish, but I was working with those Labour students who were working with the Union of Jewish Students in the mid-1980s to prevent the far left from banning Jewish societies on university campuses. So this is not a problem that's just arisen with the elevation of Jeremy Corbyn in 2015 to the leadership. It goes back a long way. And as I say, these rivers run deep. So at one level, the report has its origins back in the mid-1980s. At another level, there was a very specific moment when I decided I was going to work up my notes about the anti-Semitism crisis in Labour into this report. And that was when my own union leader, Len McCluskey, responded to the resignation of a series of Labour MPs. Joan Ryan, that evening, she resigned with them. And almost all of those Labour MPs, some of them Jewish, said that it was the failure of the party to tackle anti-Semitism in the party that had led to their resignations. And in my judgment, at least, Len McCluskey looked at the camera and smirked slightly and said the words, in his view, it's all contrived. In other words, made up. And from that moment, I thought, no, you're really not on. That's really not acceptable to respond in that way to the pain and the anguish of these MPs and the warning that they're giving to the party as a whole. So I decided to write the report at that moment. What the report is around 130 cases of both anti-Semitism and, equally important, anti-Semitism denial and victim blaming in the party. In the party at the moment, you will often hear the idea that the anti-Semitism talk is, as Len said, contrived. It's a fraud. It's a plot. It doesn't exist. It's a few crazies who don't really mean anything and so on. So I knew I needed a huge amount of evidence, case upon case upon case, to persuade members who I hope will read the report that this is not contrived. It's not just a tiny fringe. It's a real significant problem that the party faces to tackle. On the basis of having collected these 130 examples together, I make two claims in the report. The first claim is that the Labour Party can be defined as institutionally anti-Semitic. This, I don't know if this is a phrase that's used often in America, but in the UK it has huge resonance because it stems from a report called the Macpherson Report in 1999 into the racist murder of a young black man called Stephen Lawrence and the perceived and the actual failures of the police to investigate that racist crime properly. So the report became as much about the state of British policing in terms of its relationship to the black community as it did into one particular murder. And Macpherson developed the notion of institutionally anti-Semitic. The police, he said, were institutionally anti-Semitic. So that's the phrase that I'm using in the report. And I'm also using the definition which Macpherson developed to say that far from being contrived, that's where the party's at. That's the first claim. The second claim is that if you step back from the immediate cases of anti-Semitism and you place the crisis in four wider shaping contexts, I think you'll see that far from this being a problem that can be dealt with easily, it will be very difficult to eradicate because these contexts are to do with the deep, long-standing traditions of left anti-Semitism on the left, to do with the changes in the party since 2015, and to do with the leader himself and what I see as his inadequacies and his failures to lead on this. So they're the two claims the report makes. The party's institutional anti-Semitic. Put in a bigger context, it's going to be very difficult to deal with, but we have to try.
But you said that you started working against anti-Semitism on the left wing of British politics or in Labour Party already in the 1980s.
Yeah.
So that has nothing to do with Corbyn, right?
Yes. Corbyn, I think, is one of the factors. In the mid-1980s, if you remember at that time, the United Nations definition of Zionism as racism was still in place. So some people on the far left argued, well, if Zionism is racism and we as a students' union have a policy of no platform for racists, well, we need to no platform these Zionists. So we need to deny them the right to have their Jewish society. So, but the history of left anti-Semitism goes back, you can go back to the late 19th century. I talk in the report about what was called at the time the socialism of fools. So that was an expression of the German social democratic leader, Bebel, who said, following Friedrich Engels, who said, look, this idea that, you know, capitalism is Jewish or the banks are Jewish or finances are Jewish.
I'm sorry, I'll interrupt you, but in that article where Engels first time uses the expression socialism of fools, he also declares Marx to be Jew. And that is Marx already dead. Marx probably turned in his grave when, after all his life, his closest friend called him a Jew.
He was certainly not, in any sense at all, a religious Jew, or he didn't live a Jewish life of any description. I mean, even Engels himself, by the way, some of his private letters talk about the Jews of Poznan in very derogatory ways. So the problem goes back to a tendency to identify the Jews as somehow the archetypal capitalists or the central or main obstacle to socialism in the 19th century. It goes through a whole phase.
So that is what you're saying, that this is this derogatory, the dismissive, to put it mildly, attitude toward Jewish people is at the core of the entire socialist conception of the world?
No, I wouldn't say that. Certainly, I'm on the left myself, and I would think of myself as a democratic socialist. And it's been a battle within the left. I don't think by any means the majority of the left throughout the left's entire history has been anti-Semitic, but we shouldn't minimize the problem either. I don't know if you can say, I'm going to hold up a book that in the mid-1980s, this book by Steve Cohen, it's called That's Funny You Don't Look Anti-Semitic. And you can still find it today on the Engage website. The Engage website where the PDF is there. Steve Cohen was a member of the International Marxist Group. He was a radical socialist and a member of the Jewish Socialist Group in the UK. But his book puts together really a mass of quotations from all the strands of the left, socialist, communist, and anarchist, and certainly which express this left anti-Semitism. In Britain, we had a lot of the socialism of fools too. In the report, I quote from Steve's book about the Independent Labour Party and the Social Democratic Federation in the editorials in the 1890s, talking about, quote, Jew moneylenders controlling every foreign office in Europe, saying that whenever there's trouble in the world, I'm quoting now, whenever there's trouble in the world, some hook-nosed Rothschild will be near the scene. These are quotes from the Independent Labour Party editorials of the 1890s and so on. So it's a tradition that goes back a long way of somehow identifying Jewishness with capitalism and seeing the Jew as the archetypal moneybags capitalist. And it was denounced at the time as the socialism of fools, and has been consistently since by, I would say, a majority of the left, but it's there.
It's very interesting. When I hear you talk, I was born in the Soviet Union in 1954. In 1968, I became politically aware because of Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. I wrote a letter of protest to Brezhnev about it. And then in 1970, in school, at my last year of school, I and three of my friends established an organization called Communist Prometheus. Now, I considered, you see, in the Soviet Union, all this anti-Semitism of Marx and socialists was all thoroughly cleaned up. I was not aware of anything that you just mentioned, even close, about socialism and anti-Semitism, because, you know, after October Revolution, any indication of anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, at least until the end of the Second World War, was considered to be the first step toward anti-Soviet activities. Now, when we established Communist Prometheus, our main demand was abolition of Article 6, abolition of the leading role of the Communist Party, and all power to the Soviets. Basically, sort of maybe like some Trotskyites may interpret it, going back to the ideal of revolution. But in any case, listening, now I know differently, like you say, that the tradition of anti-Semitism within socialist movement is very old one, going back to God knows how long.
Mm-hmm. I certainly think immediately after the October Revolution, there was, Sverdlov was the first president and so on, was Jewish, and there was a drive against anti-Semitism. I think my analysis would be with the degeneration of the revolution in the 20s, you certainly see elements of anti-Semitism in the fight against the opposition, against both. So the oppositionists were routinely given their Jewish names in the press to identify them. Moscow trials.
Kill Jews, save Russia was the central slogan of the white anti-revolutionaries.
That's true. What I'm saying is that the Stalinists in the 1920s certainly had their own traditions of anti-Semitism when it was functional for them to attack the opposition. So you can have Trotsky writing to Bukharin in, I think, 25 and saying, how is it possible that in our branches of our own Communist Party, there's anti-Semitism being openly used to attack the left opposition and the oppositionists? You then have a whole series of decades, really, from the 40s to the 80s, of the state promotion of anti-Semitism in the form of anti-Zionism, so-called, by the communist parties throughout the world, which, again, the impact of this on the global left, I think, has been hugely underestimated. We're talking about publications coming out decade upon decade, being translated into many languages, and pushed around the left globally, which most of the attitudes that we see now, which I would call anti-Semitic anti-Zionism, where anti-Israelism goes so far it becomes akin to the old anti-Semitism. Most of them originate in this long period of Stalinist era Judeo-phobic agitation and propaganda. Zionism is racism, Zionism is imperialism, Zionism is Nazism, Israel is a Nazi state. All of these ideas are there from really the late 40s until the collapse of the Soviet bloc.
But why is it surprising? I mean, going back to Lenin and going back before him, the idea of history as a way toward disappearance, total disappearance of Jews, is ever present in every major socialist thinker. I mean, the idea, in fact, many Jewish socialists became socialists because they have swallowed this idea that eventually not only all nations, but first of all, Jewish nation will disappear or assimilate or whatever it is, just will, because there's not going to, the socialists don't believe in God. You know, the materialist foundation of socialist ideology is very old. And Jews do believe without God, for Jews cannot, there's no point of existence. So combination of what you said before, you know, that Jews, you know, are going to disappear because capitalism will disappear because they're an integral part of the capitalist society, but also because they're going to disappear because people will stop believing in God. And so there's not going to be point for Jews. There's point for French and English and Germans and Ukrainians and Russians because they're ethnic collectivities, but Jews as a religious collectivity or ethno-religious collectivity, there's no point for them in the future.
Sure, I think that's right. I think the left, it wasn't just a case of opportunistically using anti-Semitism in a context of the Cold War when you were trying to build alliances with Arab states. That was certainly part of the picture. But I think going back further, as you say, there's a problem that the left had with a couple of its own central values, which generally speaking are good values to have, I think, assimilationism and universalism. It's good that people mix. It's good that we don't hold up the barriers between us too much. It's good that we see each other as equals on the planet. When it was applied by the left to the Jews, however, I think it became much more problematic. I think the left tended to think that the only possible or acceptable Jewish response to anti-Semitism was assimilation into the societies of which they were a part. They also tended to think that Zionism was wholly reactionary. They thought that it was that universalism would come about through socialism, through a world revolution, and that anti-Semitism would be swept away, burnt away, if you like, in the heat of the socialist revolution and so on. That was the dream. I think the problem the left had was that history didn't go that way. History went in a very different direction to the left hopes. It went in the direction of the defeat, the degeneration of the Russian Revolution, the failure of the European revolutions in the 20s and 30s, the rise of fascism, the rise of Nazism, the Shoah in one of the most advanced industrial societies in Europe, the creation of the State of Israel. That's a very, very different history than the one the left anticipated. And the problem is the left didn't get the memo. The left did not respond to that rupture in world history in mid-century. So it retained its old, rigid, dogmatic anti-Zionism, its rigid commitment to assimilationism and universalism after the Shoah and after the creation of Israel. Now, I think anti-Zionism changes its political meaning fundamentally before and after that rupture in world history. Before that rupture, it's by and large a debate, often amongst Jews themselves, about the best response to anti-Semitism. Should we create a nation state? Should we fight where we are? That's a political debate at that moment after the Holocaust and after the creation of the State of Israel. If you retain a dogmatic anti-Zionism, it has a very, very different political meaning. At the one level, it means that one state in the world, the little Jewish state, has to be abolished. You want to rewind history. And as the Jews who live in Israel are not going to agree voluntarily to that rewinding, you're actually talking about conquest. So the left, often without realizing what it's doing with its anti-Zionism, has got itself into a position where it's kind of implicitly for a program of conquest. Secondly, it tends to redefine most of the Jews in the world who, even though they're very critical Zionists or non-critical, if you take Zionism as meaning simply support for the existence of a Jewish homeland in what was Palestine, most Jews in the world would be Zionists in that sense. And they're mostly redefined by the left because of its anti-Zionism and its failure to respond to that rupture in world history. They're defined as really to be blackballed out of the club, to be banned from the public space, hence the attempt to ban Jewish societies, which, by the way, we've had repeated in the UK in the last month or so. There was an attempt at the University of Essex to stop a Jewish society forming. Now, positively, it was immediately responded to by both the university authorities and many, many students, and that attempt was swiftly defeated. But the fact that it can still happen is significant.
It's very interesting to stop Jewish society, student Jewish society, from being formed. Did they also make an attempt to stop Muslim society from being formed, student society?
Well, no, and absolutely, and that is absolutely the point. The problem about contemporary anti-Zionism is it's a program to abolish one nation state in the world, Israel, but only one. It's a program to demonize Zionism, and it's a movement to push one set of people out of the common economic, educational, and cultural life of humanity through boycott, sanctions, and divestment, and so on. So it's, I just simply don't, I'm not really that interested whether an individual person in their head, to which I have no access, is a Jew hater of Jews as Jews. I don't know about their intent. What I do know is if that you want to abolish one single nation state in the world, and it just happens to be the little Jewish one, I'm not that interested in your protestations that you're not an anti-Semite. I think it's an objectively anti-Semitic position to want to abolish the existing expression of Jewish self-determination in the world, Israel. It's not anti-Semitic to criticize Israel. One of the things in the report that I talk about a lot is to say, look, there's a red herring in this debate, which is that somehow it is it's all about stopping criticism of Israel. Now, if you take the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which the Labour Party has adopted, by the way, in 2018 after a lot of pressure, it is absolutely clear that criticism of Israel, in the same way you'd criticize any other nation state, cannot be defined as anti-Semitic. So I also go on in the report to specify whether you think it's fair or not, if you want to say the occupation is wrong and there should be a Palestinian state tomorrow, that for me is not anti-Semitic. If you want to say the settlement expansion is wrong, that's not anti-Semitic. If you want to say the way in which Israel responds to Hamas rockets and terror is disproportionate, I might have a discussion with you about that, but it's not anti-Semitic in my view for you to say it. And if you have criticisms of the position of the Arab minority, similarly, it's not anti-Semitic. And therefore, 4 huge, sharp criticisms of current Israeli policy. I don't think any of them are anti-Semitic. And more to the point, in the report, I don't think there's a single example I give of all of the suspensions from the party or expulsions from the party or cases of what I define as anti-Semitism. Not one of them come under those 4 headings. It is the biggest red herring, the idea that the anti-Semitism crisis is to do with people trying to stop criticism of Israel. And more to the point, what I say in the report is that denialism, that denial that the problem is actually about anti-Semitism, is one of the most significant obstacles the party faces to doing anything about the crisis it's in. It's why the crisis has rolled from 2015 to 16 to 17 to 18 to 19 and shows no sign of going away, because the party keeps wanting to tell itself it doesn't really exist. It's about these Zionists or these Blairites trying to stop criticism of Israel. The report is trying to encourage the party to get off that perch and say to itself, we've got a real problem and we're going to deal with it.
Now, you've been working on the issue of anti-Semitism on the left in Britain for what you said, like 30 years. And it seems like in the last 4 years, since Corbyn came to lead the Labour Party, in fact, the Labour Party surged ahead massively in England. So Do you consider your work of 30 years to be a failure?
The first thing I should say is I haven't been engaged non-stop in this for 30 years. I've written about a lot of other things, but it's an issue that I've come back to in a major way since about 2015. What I would say about the surge, it certainly has been a surge. Membership has increased hugely, so it's now, I think, the biggest party in Europe. And at the 2017 election, the party did very well. It's still my party. It did very well, and it increased its vote, I think, at the biggest increase since 45.
So
election compared to election.
So the anti-Semitism within. I'm sorry.
What I would say to you, sorry, is it's not to do with attitudes towards Jews. None of that surge in membership, none of that electoral strength is to do with this issue. It is completely to do with a country that feels it's undergone an economic crash, which was the fault of a certain set of people, and then another set of people had to pay for it with austerity and depression. And there's a huge bank of feeling in the country that we've had enough of that and we need a new direction, especially in terms of economics. We feel there's crises in everything from social care to education to health to housing to homelessness and so on. So I think if I'm talking to Jews abroad, I would certainly say don't misinterpret the surge in membership of the party and electoral strength of the party as somehow an expression of anti-Semitism in the UK. I don't think it's that.
No,
not at all.
But statistics shows that anti-Semitism in UK, like in continental Europe and the United States, dramatically up in the last few years.
The best source for people to go if they want to find out about that is the organisation in the UK which collects those statistics is the Community Security Trust, the CST, and it produces an annual report both about anti-Semitic incidents and anti-Semitic discourse, and they're fantastic organization, fantastic reports, and you can go to consult them there. I think the CST would still say, and if they wouldn't, I would still say that anti-Semitism in the UK is still confined to three largely political expressions. One is on the far right, which we're aware of. One is in some parts of some Muslim communities to do with the influence of Islamism, and one is elements of the far left, again, not the whole left. Now, I think what CST and everyone will be particularly alert to is the danger of some of those political anti-Semitisms becoming part of the mainstream and creating a discourse and a way of talking which is picked up by much wider layers of people. So that's the real battle, and this report is partly about trying to stop that crossover from what is in fact a political anti-Semitism on a part of the left into mainstream society.
But the way I see it, you're of course right that anti-Semitism is not the central issue of labor politics, but it's a significant side issue, and it's not a trivial one. The way I see it, in the United States at least, this intersectionalist movement, by the way, I do not know if in England, what is the idea that Labour Party is trying to pursue? Are they still talking about socialism, or are they talking about, what are they talking about?
Well, the Labour Party has certainly moved leftwards since 2015 when Jeremy Corbyn became leader of the party. Obviously, everyone will have their own views on this, and anything I have to say on this question is me speaking very personally. I think there are two projects in the contemporary Labour Party. I call them myself the Class Project and the Camp Project. The Class Project I'm largely supportive of, which is I don't think social democratic parties like ours have much of a future if they embrace a neoliberal economic model. I don't think that works for people or for planet. So figures like John McDonnell, the shadow chancellor, have moved the party to a much more, I think it's still a basically social democratic, but a serious, radical social democratic economic program that we would like to pursue in office to shift power and wealth back towards working people. It's certainly got nothing to do with, communist program as such. I think that's a class project which is necessary. A lot of towns have been left behind. Their infrastructure is in tatters. A lot of people experience unemployment. Social care of the elderly and so on is in a mess. It needs an overhaul. Classrooms are overcrowded and education budgets are too low. The National Health Service is under strain. And people have had enough of this. So they want a more radical redistributionist economic policy. I think that's one project. The second project of the contemporary Labour Party I would call a camps project or a two-camp project. What I mean by that is the left, which Jeremy Corbyn comes out of, and the left, which some of his key advisors come from too, is a left which is in thrall, captured by a certain philosophy. One of the reasons this anti-Semitism crisis has so much grip on the party is that it emerges out of a certain kind of philosophical basis. Now, it's present in the academia as much as it's present in the ward meetings. I call it the two camps philosophy, which is the idea that you can divide the entire world and all that is in it into two camps, the good oppressed camp and the bad oppressor camp. And it's the job of the left to cheer on the oppressed and to oppose the oppressor. And it's pretty simple in this worldview who these forces are. Sometimes it's called empire against resistance and so on. But it's a very crude view of the world in which a lot of our left-wing values can't find a place. For example, let me make it concrete. If you go walking down a high street and you're holding up a banner and that banner says, "We're all Hezbollah now," which happened in London. In London demonstration, people holding up a banner, "We're all Hezbollah now." Then there's no space in your worldview anymore for democracy, for freedom, for feminism, for gender equality, for anti-authoritarianism, for anti-totalitarianism. So the left used to have a package of values, and with this package of values, it would orientate itself in the world to support or oppose.
Yeah, but the central element of the left, the most powerful idea of the left was always class struggle, not things that you just mentioned. Those things were just side things that the socialists or the communists or whoever you want to call it, attach themselves to in order to gain extra people on their side. And talking about the anti-Semitism, as you say, this is not the central issue. I do believe that anti-Semitism for the left today is the central issue. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the whole idea of socialism has collapsed. And left today has no central idea outside of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, that is the central, and you say that the Corbyn, this is just a byproduct, a side, and just infatuation with this idea. But I say all of his supporters, and Hezbollah and Hamas in England, I'm talking about supporters, and all other non-Islamic supporters, they all have this anti-Semitism as cement of their different interests and ideologies, bringing them to Labour Party.
I would take a different view from the ground here. I would say that certainly in terms of membership of the surge of people who've come into the party, my rough guess would be 9 out of 10, 19 out of 20 of those people would have joined the party because they're anti-austerity, and to some extent they're anti-capitalist, and they want to see a more social democratic or redistributionist economic and social policy. I would say that. However, where I think you're right is that a lot of the key figures, his central advisors, do come out of a certain tradition of the left, which has this two camps philosophy. The camp they used to support was the Soviet Union, the socialist camp, as they would say. They've translated that two camp view into the modern post-Cold War world. And this is what it does to Israel and Palestine. And this is, I think, is the key thing to understand, that when you apply that very crude two camps, oppressor, oppressed, empire, resistance view of the world to Israel and Palestine, I think you turn what is a very complicated, unresolved national question, and these things are not unusual. Unresolved national questions are not surprises to us. They've existed around the world at various times. Some of them still exist today. That's what we have. Two peoples struggling over a land, and it's an unresolved national question. Negotiations have not been successful so far. They turn that tragic conflict into a cartoon. They turn it into a cartoon. It becomes a morality play peopled only by wholly good and wholly evil people. One side is to be exfoliated completely, and the other is to be romanticized and supported.
Yeah, but mind you, of dozens and dozens and dozens of different land-based and nationality-based and sovereignty-based conflicts, it's only that conflict with Jews that figures prominently in any way whatsoever in the mind of these people.
I absolutely agree. It's not the only one they ever talk about, but it's the one that they obsess about. It's the one that they make the center of their concerns. Now, there's a difficult argument to have there. If you say to somebody, well, you shouldn't be concerned about this, I prefer to say to people, look, you're concerned about this, okay, but actually learn about the reality of the situation on the ground. If you talk to Israelis or Palestinians, which I have, in a room over weekends in hotels as part of discussions to try and move processes forward, you get a completely different discussion than the one you get in the organized left and far left. That latter discussion is a cartoon-like discussion. They don't understand the complexities of the situation. They don't understand Israel's need for security. They don't understand what the problem is of simply saying right of return, untrammeled, so that Israel no longer becomes a Jewish state. They don't understand any of those complexities. They don't understand what happened in 1948, what happened in 1967 often. So you get a kind of ignorance and a reduction of a complicated conflict into something that looks almost cartoon-like, but very, very easy to handle. One side you cheer, the other side you boo. So Hamas, for instance, they simply do not understand what is in Hamas's charter. They don't understand that Hamas is an Islamist movement. It's not a secular nationalist movement. It's an Islamist movement which is committed canonically to the destruction of Israel as because it's an invasion of the Islamic Waqf and so on. They don't understand that. So therefore, the difficulty that Israel has in relating to Hamas is not understood either. And so I try to say, look, let's talk about the conflict as it is. Let's talk about mutual recognition. Let's talk about sharing. Let's talk about compromise. Let's talk about what the international community can do in order to bring about a return to the peace process. Because your activism, your one-sided, polarizing activism, is making it harder to resolve the conflict, not easier. It's not actually very good for the Palestinians. You get a lot of people on the left who are what I call more Palestinian than the Palestinians, or they try to be. So it's absurd. You have this absurdity of people from Paris and London and Berlin and Frankfurt and so on trying to police the Palestinian national movement from the left. The farce of trying to say that a Salam Fayyad or a Fatah figure is a sellout and that actually the real true people are Hamas and so on. Ludicrous. So we've got to get past all of that and recover the kind of left, which actually Nelson Mandela talked about. Nelson Mandela said, we recognize Zionism as a legitimate Jewish nationalism and Israel as having the right to security and viability, and we also recognize Palestinian nationalism. And he wanted to, as he said, facilitate and enable those two peoples to come to an accommodation together. Now, the debate about how you do that is a separate debate. It's hugely complicated, but the basic orientating stance of the left should be two states for two peoples by negotiation, and how can we help?
Well, this is one approach, but my interest in tackling this issue is if the left can be made pro-Israel. I don't believe that they can be made neutral, because Israel and Jews have been at the center of the thinking of humanity in one way or the other for thousands of years. So just simply to say that, they're going to be ignoring it, that's not what I'm talking about. But I do believe that history has shown that anybody who is against Jews is on the side of evil. That's number one. Now, you may not believe in such conception of evil. I do. Now, and I'm looking at your report where you quote Mitchel Cohen, a former editor of Dissent in the United States, who wrote an essay, Anti-Semitism and the Left That Does Not Learn. Now, does not learn. Why? The left is stupid, or it does not want to learn?
Mitchel's a friend of mine. I'd urge everyone to read that article, by the way. I think it's especially if you're on the left, you should have a look at that article. It's called, as you say, The Left That Does Not Learn. It's available on the Dissent website, of which I used to be an editor. Mitchel's argument is that when he talks about a left that does not learn, he's saying, here's what the left used to do. It used to put aside its best instincts and its best values and its principles, and it used to put them all aside, put them in a box and say, well, we'll get to them later, but in the meantime, we have to defend the Soviet Union. It was an either-or approach. It was a two-camps approach. We oppose the West, therefore we have to support the Soviet Union. So we will soft pedal on our criticisms of the human rights abuses, the tyranny, the labor camps, and so on. In doing so, not over the course of a weekend, by the way, but over the course of decades, the left turned itself inside out. It made itself into a force which is often takes the attitude of my enemy's enemy is my friend. I'm a negativist. I'm an anti-Westerner before I'm pro my own values. It defined the left as apologists for tyranny. They would make excuses for the labor camps, excuses for the tyranny. They would invent ludicrous notions of democracy, which were somehow more democratic than actual democracy in the West. So they ruined themselves. There was a kind of self-immolation process went on of the left over decades when it took this apologetic attitude towards Stalinism. And I think what Mitchell means by not learning is that we're in danger of repeating the experience. Now, in my view, the key advisors around Jeremy Corbyn, Seamus Milne, his head of communications, Andrew Murray, his chief political advisor, these are two individuals who are absolutely influential in the contemporary Labour Party. And do you know what their background is? They are hardline, what we used to call tanky Stalinists who came out of decades of Labour inside the British Communist Party. Wow. That's who they are. That's where they were formed. And now they're Jeremy Corbyn's key advisors. They are the people who practiced that kind of apologetics. So Andrew Murray, for instance, is on record as saying he thinks Stalin created socialism in a sixth of the world. Now, you take that attitude and you translate it to the present day where the Communist parties aren't so influential, but who are? Well, the Islamists are, the anti-Semites are, the authoritarians are, and they take the same kind of sensibility and mindset and they apply it again. So, for instance, Jeremy Corbyn himself, go on YouTube, you'll find this. Jeremy Corbyn said of Hamas and Hezbollah, not just that they were his friends, and he's also called them the brothers, but that they were, and the exact quote is in the report, I think I'm being accurate when I say, forces for peace and justice throughout the entire region. Now, these are fascistic forces. Hamas and Hezbollah, let's be blunt with our language, these are fascistic political forces who have zero connection to anything the left has believed in terms of democracy and equality and feminism and liberty and so on. So why does a man like Jeremy Corbyn get himself in a position where he can say such nonsense about Hamas and Hezbollah? Because he's part of the left that doesn't learn. They're still doing the apologetics. They're still doing the two-camp view of the world. They're still negativist rather than putting their positive values first. And I'll just finish on one story which I think for many people fixes it in their mind how serious the problem is. A man called Raad Salah, who's an Israeli-based Islamist, visited the UK. He was allowed in, he shouldn't have been allowed in, but he was allowed in. Once he was allowed in, Jeremy Corbyn came to his support in a very vocal and very explicit way. He didn't just say, this man has the right to speak. Again, you can see all this online and see the quotations. He said of Raad Salah that he was a very good leader of his people, and he wanted to invite him to have tea on the terrace of the House of Commons with himself, Jeremy Corbyn. Now, who's Rod Saller? Rod Saller isn't someone who pressurizes the Netanyahu government and says Netanyahu's wrong. Rod Saller is someone who says the Jews are the bacteria of all times. Rod Saller is someone who said 9/11 was caused by the prime mover. Now, I'll give you one guess as to who he's talking about. This is a man who was convicted in Israel of using the blood libel, the old medieval blood libel about the Jews, in a speech in Israel. And you can see the speech online. Now, when Jeremy Corbyn was pointed to all of these links, he said, well, he's never said anything like that to me. To which in a report, I make the point, try and imagine this. Can we imagine a Labour Party leader who's told, look, you're going to meet this anti-black racist. You shouldn't meet him because here are all the racist things he's said. Can we imagine a Labour Party leader who responds to that request by saying, well, he's never said those things to me? We can't. It's literally not imaginable that that's how a Labour Party leader would respond. But in this case, he did. And to this day has not apologized. Now, and this is where Jeremy Corbyn is part of the problem the party has. I personally do not think he's the leader who's capable of seeing the party through this crisis. He simply has too many links over too many years to too many people, which he's not willing to apologize for in a fundamental auto-critique, a fundamental self-critique of his own record. He's not willing to do that. Consequently, party members, naturally wanting to defend their leader, don't feel they can criticize him either. And I think that's how there's a normalization of what I would call anti-Semitic forms of anti-Zionism in the party. If what Jeremy Corbyn has done with Rod Saller, with Eisen, with the One World Trust, with his statements about Hamas and Hezbollah, with his interventions on Holocaust Memorial Day, if that whole record is not fundamentally criticized, then it becomes normalized. It's no longer something we think is outrageous and terrible and shameful and something we're going to be intensely critical of and break from radically, but it's something that we say, well, there was this situation, there was that, maybe, who knows, and there's different views, and he didn't mean it, and it was all for people. So we soft soap our opposition to all this, and that creates an environment in which certain kinds of discourse can proliferate. So he is the problem as well.
Ellen, hearing you, the thought comes to my mind and the question, and I want to ask you, and we'll finish the interview because it's almost an hour now. Given what has been happening on the left wing in Labour Party in England, and I see what is happening in the United States with basically anti-Semitic politicians already in the Congress, talking out loud and loudly and getting no resistance and more support. Now, some resistance you can see, but it's only in words, not in deeds. My question to you is, given what I consider to be the failure of the wing, of the segment of the left, represented by people like you, to stop the development within broader left wing in England regarding the anti-Semitism, do you have any suggestion for people in the United States how to approach it and what to do about it?
Well, I'll come on to that. The one thing I would say to your viewers, in case they get a mistaken impression of what's going on in the party, I just give them one fact, which is that the entire parliamentary Labour Party met in session and passed a resolution unanimously to say we must get a grip on this and tackle anti-Semitism, or we're going to become institutionally anti-Semitic. So there's a lot of opposition to this within the party, and if the party doesn't sort it out, I'm sure that will be expressed in organizational forms in the future. But in terms of what can be done in America, I would say people need to educate other people about the conflict. I think the conflict has taken on, partly in an internet age, in an age of memes and hashtags and so on, almost everything is being simplified. I think if the conflict is allowed to become a cartoon with heroes and villains, then, and it's allowed to become an issue of where left identity is wholly invested in one side and not the other, then it's a problem. If we allow people to make Israel-Palestine into an issue which is as clear-cut as, say, apartheid South Africa was, then we've got a problem. So I think we need to say to people, look, Hamas and Hezbollah are not your friends. Your friends are people such as the One Voice movement, the peace builders on either side of the conflict, who have been trying, with some success, to build better relationships between people, new forms of joint institutions, better attitudes towards each other, new forms of schools. And these organizations, there's many, many of them with Israelis and Palestinians, they should be relating to those peace-building organizations and institutions, trying to bring them over to America, bring them to talk to bookshops and to talk to congressional leaders and so on, and get off the two camps view, which is that this is a simple conflict of good and evil, and we cheer on one side and we boo the other. I think most of the anti-Semitism bubbling up in the Labour Party and being expressed has its roots in that very crude, very wrong-headed, simplistic view of the conflict itself. Some of it is about Jew hatred. I mean, you'll see the examples in the report. If viewers go to read it, they will see there are even old Hitlerian expressions of Jew hatred, absolutely vile, horrible. The bulk of them, however, are about a certain excessive, demonizing way of talking about Israel. So what happens is that the things that people used to say about Israel, about Jews, sorry, that's what they now say about Israel. So they don't say about Israel, it should retreat more quickly from the West Bank. They say Zionism, a disembodied global Zionism, which sounds very like the way people used to talk about the old stereotypical Jew. Zionism controls the media. Zionism controls finance.
But there's nothing new about it. You know, in Soviet Union, the same thing was in 1960s and 70s and later.
That's where a lot of the, absolutely.
All the books and all kinds of things. And
that's where a lot of it comes from.
I want to ask you about this issue, because that was the issue, you know, talking about building bridges between Jewish Israeli and Palestinian society. That sounds nice, but I do not see on Palestinian side any segment, any significant segment of Palestinian society that wants to build bridges. In fact, most of them want war.
I would say the current situation we're in is a very difficult one, because there's no ongoing peace process, and that saps a lot of hope from people, and people retreat. I wouldn't disagree with you radically in terms of, if you look at a figure like Salam Fayyad, I think eventually he was ignored, then he was pushed aside by others. I think Fayyad was someone who was, in my personal view, who was serious about reaching out and coming to some kind of accommodation. I think when the peace process was at its height, a lot of Palestinians had very different attitudes, and this was expressed in public opinion.
When Yasser Arafat was in charge, that was positive, that was promising.
I'm not talking about the leadership of the movement, especially as he reacted to the breakdown of talks. I'm talking about many ordinary Palestinians. Opinion polls at the time said that they were in the space of settling for a two-state solution. I know at the moment that the opinion polls tell us that opinion is in both Israel and in Palestine is down. That happens when there's no peace process. But see, my point of view is simply this, that if it isn't to be dialogue, mutual recognition, and a sharing of the land, then what is it going to be?
Yeah, I do not,
because the alternatives are often unspoken, and I think they do not look any better than the struggle for a two-state solution. I think that struggle looks better than the alternatives.
This prescription sounds like prescription that was in the United States in 1970s and 80s. That is, we need to talk, you know, trip to see my little girl to see Andropov and things like this. This is where peace and brotherhood. While in the Soviet Union, there was no place for anybody. There was Angela Davis that could travel anywhere she wanted and say anything she wanted. But there was nobody in the Soviet Union that could leave Soviet Union and come back, who was opposed.
But let's not forget, as not in the 70s and 80s, but as recently as I think it was 2007 and 8, the Annapolis peace process came close to finding a solution. Look, I've spoken to the people who were involved in that process. They were there till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, poring over maps and agreements, making progress. Maps were shared. The political constellation on either side wasn't right for them to see it through. But if we can go back only just slightly over a decade to a situation where a Palestinian and Israeli leader with American support and European support came close to dividing the land, then I know political circumstances are not there at the moment. I appreciate that. I'm not naive at all. But I don't think it's time to give up on the idea that that kind of mutual recognition and sharing could be the solution to what is an ongoing and tragic, unresolved national question. And then I simply repeat, those people who say it's not possible have a responsibility to tell us what their alternative is. Not tomorrow. I understand the alternative isn't available for anybody tomorrow for anything really, but in the longer term, if it's not to be mutual accommodation and sharing and compromise and separation, what is it to be?
I guess war.
Well, we don't want that, so let's keep trying.
Okay. Well, in any case, I thank you, Ellen. I thank you very, very much for this very insightful presentation and for letting us see at least one segment of the democratic left in Britain. And I have to say, I'm very, very, I feel very good about the fact that there are people like you, period. But I still, after this interview, feel not good about what is happening not only in the United Kingdom, but also in the United States.
I understand. Alexander, can I tell your viewers about one more person they should know about and the book that he's written?
Please.
It would be helpful to them. It's a friend of mine called David Hirsch. David's an academic, been a friend of mine for over 30 years, and he's written a wonderful book called Contemporary Left, Anti-Semitism. And much more than my report, this is the book that really pulls the whole story together in a way that I think people will find very, very helpful. So
very good recommendation. What we're going to do, we're going to put a link below the video toward your websites and toward this website. I'm going to find it on Amazon, and we're going to put a link on Amazon so people can purchase. And let's see, maybe it would be also interesting to talk to Mitchel Cohen, you know, if he is available, and if he is your friend, maybe you can ask him about it, because I'd like to talk to him. I know that being editor of Dissent, he had to know Jimmy Weinstein, who was the publisher of In These Times, and to talk to him about it. I mean, given that he talks about these things as well. In any case, Ellen, nice talking to you, and I hope to talk to you again in the future, and have a great, great day, whatever remains of it.
Same to you. Thanks very much for inviting me on. Appreciate it.
Thank you for being here.
Bye-bye.